Today I am joined by Dr. Sue Conlan on the podcast. Sue has specialised exclusively in the field of international migration, asylum and human rights since 1987 in both the voluntary sector and legal aid firms. Her experience includes legal casework, research, training, political advocacy, consultancy, media and public speaking on migration and asylum issues and wider human rights issues. Sue's research includes the link between immigration control and public funds in the UK, people smuggling and migration, and asylum policy and practice in the UK and Ireland. In 2020, Sue set up Tactic Immigration and Asylum CIC to provide training to organisations supporting people seeking asylum or people who are in the UK illegally. Now, I know Sue from back in my days in Dublin when Sue worked for the Irish Refugee Council. I think this is a really important episode. I really enjoyed asking Sue some of the questions, knowing her background and knowing her expertise in this area in both political matters concerning immigration and also the law. So we also cover the benefits of working. We discuss the challenges of working in immigration, but also the benefits. And there's no better person to go through all of the topics that we discussed today. And I hope you enjoy today's episode. And also remember to keep in check with us around our book club. There'll be details on the Activist Lawyer website and all of our social media channels. Thank you all for your support so far. And if you enjoy the podcast, please remember to review it and to share with other listeners, family and friends. Enjoy today. Hello everybody and welcome to today's episode of the Activist Lawyer podcast. Thank you, Sue, for joining me.
Thank you, it's a pleasure.
So I follow you and your work with great interest, Sue, around matters usually impacting immigration, refugee and asylum law, as well as the political discourse around migration and immigration, which is topical at the minute. Indeed, we might say it's when is it ever not topical. So we'll talk a little bit about your work and your practice, but I'm wondering firstly, can you bring us back in time a little bit and let us know how you started your career in this area of law, this very specific and niche area of practice? What or who has inspired you along the way?
Well, it does take us back. I first studied for a law degree in the late 1970s. Didn't study immigration. It wasn't a particular issue at that time. But as soon as I'd finished the degree, I went on to do a sabbatical post with the Students' Union. And on the first day of my work with them, we had a letter from Nigerian students who had been detained at Harmondsworth Immigration Detention Centre and were seeking help to stop him being removed, or what people call deported, to Nigeria. I knew nothing. I referred him to JCWI, the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants. So that was my first, intro to immigration. But the same year, we had overseas students who had suddenly, without notice, been charged what are called full cost fees for their education. So they're in the middle of a degree. They'd got a certain amount of money set aside, and they weren't allowed to continue without finding the extra money. So I had two instances that year when I was on in the sabbatical post, which sort of gave me a little bit of an insight into the way foreigners were treated, even if they were otherwise welcome because they were students and paying fees. And I tried to get into immigration, but, tried one or two jobs, didn't have any success. I had no real knowledge, no real experience. And then I started a master's degree in welfare law, and that included a little bit on immigration. And at the same time, JCWI set up its one and only branch, which was in West Midlands branch in Birmingham. And I got a job there in July 1987. That was primarily training, but also it was a second-tier agency. We were supporting other organisations that were doing the direct work. So that's how I got into it.
Well, I mean, you've extensive experience in immigration, including, all aspects of it, asylum, refugee law, citizenship, in both Ireland, where I first met you many, many moons ago, and in the UK. Two very different systems in some respects, similar in others. Is there a particular moment in your work that stands out in this kind of constantly evolving landscape of immigration? It's very hard to keep up with.
Yeah, it certainly moves on all the time, and it is very, very difficult to keep up with it, so make sure you're on top of it. And obviously at the time that I started working in Dublin with the Irish Refugee Council, the UK was part of the European Union. It was a very different type of membership to Ireland. Ireland's always been quite positive towards the EU. The UK always very sceptical and thinking that it knows better and it just needs to teach the other EU countries how to behave. So a very different attitude towards the EU. But I think what struck me nevertheless was, despite Ireland's enthusiasm for the EU, it was the fact that when it came to immigration and asylum and even citizenship, it was much more conscious of its relationship with the UK and the common travel area, and therefore followed essentially what the UK was doing more so than any other EU country. And so that meant, for example, Ireland, like the UK, was part of the common European asylum system. In fact, it held the presidency of the EU twice when key parts of this common European asylum system were being finalised. And yet, despite that, it didn't actually opt in as vigorously or as carefully as it could have done at an earliest possible stage. So I think it's been surprising how much Ireland has not really envisaged what it wants for itself, but instead has been really following the UK. And the UK is, at the end of the day, it's a different situation. But both countries have been conscious of movement between the two, and Ireland particularly conscious of movement from the UK towards Ireland. So I think that stands out. But the irony is, despite the alleged or possible diversity, the similarity is remarkable. And I think that's particularly pertinent when it comes to Ireland adopting a system of putting people claiming asylum into hotels or institutional settings. And that's been quite alarming. So, of course, what's happened with Brexit, you've got a land border between part of the UK, Northern Ireland, and the Republic of Ireland. And that has therefore led to some slightly different agreements for Northern Ireland than you have for the rest of the UK. But it's also meant that when you have people travelling from the north down to the Republic, you've got increased checks by Gardaí, particularly on people who they assume are not Irish. Yeah. And it's created its own difficulties as a result.
Yeah. I mean, it's a real stark reminder, having witnessed that here working on the border, how these political decisions directly impact people's lives without a thought for people who were living on the border, EU citizens. So it was a seismic change here and it impacted so much of our work. And just maybe staying on the political side of things a little bit, I mean, do you ever think we'll see an election campaign where immigration isn't a central issue? It seems to be front and centre with anything. And the recent shift, I suppose it's a kind of add-on question to a Labour government under Keir Starmer after 14 years, I think, of Tory rule. Are you optimistic about potential changes in immigration policy? And are you satisfied that actions, concrete actions have been taken so far?
I don't think there's any realistic prospect at the moment that immigration will not be a central issue in an election. Not because it should be, but because people will make it that in order to detract from the issues that they should really be concentrating upon. So yes, it'll be there. We've seen across other European countries, we've seen the election of right-wing governments, and therefore they are making it a serious issue. And in the UK, we give far too much airtime to people like Nigel Farage, who is constantly now, having succeeded in getting Brexit done, is now moving on to migrants and asylum seekers and refugees. So it is hard, with the media that we have, it is hard to see, certainly in the UK, that it won't be a central issue, because it's constantly distracting away from the issues that should concern people. Yes, we now have a Labour government for the first time in 14 years. I'm not optimistic. We've seen two positive changes so far. One, he scrapped the Rwanda plan, so nobody's going to be sent to Rwanda. Secondly, he's not going to renew the contract for the Bibi Stockholm barge, which is a barge with several hundred people that is off the coast of Devon, I think it is, which has really isolated people and impacted their mental health. But what we've also seen is the plan to reopen two previously closed detention centres, one at Campsfield. We've seen them say they are setting up a border control command, and we've seen Keir Starmer meet with people like Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, in order to discuss with her the plan that they have to send people claiming asylum in Italy to Albania. And of course, although they don't use the slogan "stop the boats," it's "stop the smugglers." And there is no indication that they're going to fulfill the obligations that we have under the Refugee Convention, or that they will treat people differently. What we've seen since Labour came into power, yes, positively, they're concentrating on the backlog, but asylum interviews are often short and therefore not covering the issues that need to be dealt with. We have remarkably seen an increase in the number of Afghan citizens refused since Labour came into power.
Refused?
And we had not refused. Yes, refused, and therefore having to appeal again. And we had not seen that for quite a long time. Partly because we haven't had decisions being made in so many cases. They were on hold because of Rwanda. So we're seeing refusals where we shouldn't see them. Afghans were amongst the highest group of people to be accepted as refugees.
Yeah.
They are now stuck in the appeal system and without legal representation for the best part. So I think what I'm seeing, I remember when Tony Blair and the government came into power in 1997, two very positive things came out. One, they introduced the Human Rights Act, which was huge. Secondly, they scrapped a very pernicious little part of the immigration rules that affected husbands trying to come from the Indian subcontinent called the primary purpose rule. That went. Other than that, I couldn't say I saw very much positive coming out from a Labour administration. And this one under Keir Starmer, unfortunately, I'm fearing it's going to be a repeat of what we saw under Tony Blair.
I mean, scrapping Bibi Stockholm and Rwanda is the absolute bare minimum and would be expected. But it's upsetting to hear about the Afghan cases, particularly where there were two schemes introduced by the FDCO and the Home Office that I worked under, and I got nowhere with them. They wouldn't open them up. So that's very frustrating and very depressing to hear. You mentioned there as well about the rise of far-right governments across EU, which is also concerning. But here in Ireland, and I know across the UK at various points this year, we've seen a rise of far-right aggression towards migrant communities, and that's become a real pressing issue. How did we reach this point? I mean, what steps, are there any that we can ensure safety and protection for those in the asylum process as refugees or those from migrant backgrounds, and indeed those who are working on their behalf, organisations, charities, solicitors? It seems to be really volatile.
I mean, it's been a long time in the making. If I just go back a little bit, in 1999, the UK passed legislation in which they completely withdrew the right to benefits and social housing from people seeking asylum. It had been in process, but that really made it the final step. And it allowed for the possibility of institutionalised housing for the first time. They tried hotels in the UK. It didn't really work, apart from the first reception centre. So instead, people were still going into the community. But Ireland followed suit, and it set up a system which became called direct provision, which has never been legislated, never been debated, never voted on in the Republic of Ireland, but has been in place since 2000. And Ireland stuck with it and put people into hotels, hostels, military barracks, form a butlering camp in Mosney. And therefore, you said quite early on, these people are distinct and we're going to keep them separate. Now, that doesn't explain the current violence. But since 2008, Ireland has been facing an economic crisis that has not been addressed. I mean, I would defer to people like Rory Hearn, who's at Maynooth University, when he talks about the need for a focus on housing. And it isn't there. And as a result, the cost of living has gone up. The ability of people, even if they're Irish citizens or the right to live in Ireland, to access housing that they can afford at a place they need to live in is almost non-existent. So you've got a crisis because the governments successively in the Republic of Ireland have firstly isolated people and said, these people are different, they're not part of our community. Secondly, they've let ordinary people in the communities suffer and haven't dealt with their needs. So I think there's a variety of reasons why we've seen the current crisis. But at the same time, probably housing is the biggest issue. But then what we have had under the Tories here, we had a return to the use of hotels massively over £4 million a day spent on hotels. And then we had the same problem. So we had people isolated, but quite obvious, quite noticeable where they were collectively. And then we had people like Nigel Farage, and we had Tommy Robinson, Britain First, focusing on those hotels. The other day, I watched a video of Nigel Farage going to a hotel in a place called Bromsgrove, sitting with his posh suit in the back of a smart car, going past the hotel, filming a couple of people, going into the hotel saying, "Can I book a room?" Yeah. 1.4 million people watched that video. Tommy Robinson went into the same hotel shortly after. He was knocking on doors. He was talking to, well, not talking to people, he was talking at them. And there's a direct link between the far right in the UK and the far right in Ireland. Yeah. And when we saw those disturbances last year in Dublin or wherever they were, Northern Ireland as well, there was a direct link clearly shown between the UK far right and the Irish far right. I think what's also significant, though, and I only come across this yesterday, the Republic of Ireland doesn't yet have legislation which allows it to add racism or xenophobia as an aggravating factor in a criminal act. And the European Commission has just written to the Republic of Ireland, giving it a timescale to bring in legislation that does add racism and xenophobia as an aggravating factor. It has meant to have done it since 2008. Right. Economic crisis in 2008. Yeah. What, nearly 20 years ago? No, well, not 20, my maths has gone out the window, but not been done. So even those who perhaps being targeted, who are targeting asylum seekers, are not necessarily having the full force of the law because the law isn't in place. And then, of course, we've seen people who've got their camps outside, would it be Kulak or anything else, who are setting up these campaigns. They're being allowed to do it. They're quite blatantly racist in some of the comments that some of them are distinctly making, but outsiders will jump on the back of it. I live in West Wales. Llanelli is in West Wales. We've seen exactly the same thing. Legitimate concerns, if I might use that phrase, of people about a lack of funding and input into the community. Other people come in on the back of that and exploit it. But the responsibility essentially goes back to the politicians who allow it to happen when it's taking place, the violence. But at the same time, they are the ones responsible for the policies and the practices that put asylum seekers into or migrants in a situation where they become the target, rather than addressing the problems that people have to do with cost of living, housing, employment, etc. Yeah. You went on to ask about the targeting not just of migrant communities, but also of lawyers. Obviously, there was a big issue in August in the UK when the far right seemed to have trawled through the Law Society or the list of Office of Immigration Services, Commissioner of the OISC, picked out some which were directly involved with asylum seekers and refugees. Others were doing private work, nothing to do with it other than immigration. And of course, they attempted to intimidate. There was a huge response publicly to support people in that. Unfortunately, Northern Ireland, it carried on a lot longer. No, I don't mean in terms of lawyers, but in terms of targeting, it carried on a lot longer than it was calmed down in August in the UK. But I think in terms of it being an ongoing problem, I think it's more likely to be a huge problem for lawyers who are Black or from a minority ethnic background. I give one example, and it's last year. Jackie McKenzie, human rights lawyer, partner in Lee Day Solicitors. The Conservative Party passed over a 4-page dossier which contained lies and misinformation about Jackie McKenzie to 4 newspapers. And it led to a very public campaign against her, and she had to take out additional security for herself and her family. So I think the threat is going to be greater for people who are perceived as being foreign, which isn't your pale-skinned, red-haired people like me, but it's going to be greater for people like Jackie McKenzie and other barristers have faced from an Asian background, have faced real hostility and threats against them. And I think that's where the real problem lies, because of this perception that if you're not white, you're therefore foreign and therefore go back to where you came from.
Yeah, I mean, it's truly concerning, and we've seen it here, even in recent weeks, online targeting as well. It's just horrific. We did note the Law Society and various other bodies did release statements of support for solicitors and calling this activity out, and hopefully it will die down and stop, because it's really undermining the rule of law, but very, very threatening behaviour all round. Just on Northern Ireland, and this is a question I was really hoping to get your opinion on, because it's something I've been asked about recently. Obviously, I stopped working as an immigration solicitor last year, but there's a huge problem. There's, a significant shortage of qualified immigration solicitors under the OISC, or people who are able to practice under the OISC. Have you noticed this issue elsewhere in the UK? And what do you think has led to this current crisis in accessing legal advice for immigration matters?
Yeah, it's across the board. There are certain parts of the UK that suffer more, but even, for example, in Birmingham, where I'm from, or the West Midlands, some of the biggest legal aid providers have stopped providing legal aid for immigration. And there's a number of reasons why there are struggles. Firstly, within the sector, there is a low rate of pay.
Yeah.
I stopped in legal aid practice when I came to Dublin at the start of 2010. I came back to it at the end of 2016, and I couldn't get a salary any bigger than the one I'd had at the start of 2010. So nearly 7 years later, the salary was the same. Now that's low pay is primarily connected to the legal aid rates, and the legal aid rates are so low they're going to increase them, because they haven't increased them since 1996. No. So they're looking at increasing them, and we should hear something early November. Okay. There's a low rate of pay, and people are under severe pressure in this type of work. You have to do exams, either OISC, Office of the Immigration Services Commissioner, or you have to do Law Society exams if you want to be involved in legal aid. So you've got to do exams. You once you get into a position which may be a relatively good part of pay, the pressure that you're under, it's the type of the work, because you're dealing with people who are incredibly vulnerable on the whole. And you've got a lot of admin tasks to do which aren't included in the legal aid rates that you might get paid. And legal aid, what they changed it, they didn't just limit the rate of pay per hour, but they actually made it fixed fee for a lot of the work. And therefore, you couldn't put in the time you needed to properly do a case. The reason I'm still in this line of work 37 years later is because I've been able to see the difference that my work can make for people in their lives. If I'm not able to do that because I'm limited in what I can do, if I'm a legal aid lawyer now, I'm not, then I'm not going to see that benefit to the people, and it's not going to inspire me to carry on.
Yeah.
So people are being required to jump through all sorts of hoops for a relatively low rate of pay, under severe pressure, trying to do something for people themselves who are under more pressure, and people don't want to stick to it. I mean, I found with the OISC, I understand why they're in place. Again, they were introduced by Labour in 1999. I understand why they're there, because you want to control people who are not guided by the Law Society, so they're not improperly charging fees that people shouldn't have to pay. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it really does keep you in a place where you can't actually concentrate on the work that you really need to do to get it moved on. And I've found I do train people for OIC exams.
Yeah.
And you can pass those exams, but they assist very little with practice.
I know.
It's like any exam, I suppose, in all honesty. Mm-hmm. So generally speaking, low pay, lack of support, low rates of pay. 20% of legal aid firms in England and Wales have gone out of business, have closed in the last 5 years. Yeah. That's not just immigration, that's across the board.
Yeah.
So nearly 20% have closed. And so you get junior members of staff in the firms that do have legal aid contracts working long hours for relatively low pay without necessarily the proper support and supervision. And people say, why am I doing this?
Yeah.
I want to do it. But why am I doing it? I saw a tweet just the other day where somebody said, didn't they name them, a highly respected organisation, NGO, I think in London, had advertised for a new immigration advisor's position that wasn't paying the London living wage. They're probably paying the minimum wage, but not paying the living wage. And therefore, you're inviting people to come into something that they're going to find it very hard to persist with.
Yeah, very hard to stick at. And I mean, the cases are complex enough. So a huge crisis of investment, I suppose, is the first thing that would need to happen. And we've seen it here in Northern Ireland. Even the organisations that are supporting immigration, the government funded bodies, they have nobody or maybe one staff handling a severe volume of queries even that come through, and they're not able to deal with it. It's really, really worrying. Just going back a little bit about talking about the governments there, and I'm very glad that you kind of took us through that history of Labour Tory, and nothing really has changed. But I know this is a broad question, and we had Colin Yeo on the podcast before a couple of years ago, and I asked him this as well, but what can governments do, or what can they change to improve conditions for people who are seeking refuge? In an ideal world, how would this look to envisage, I suppose, a more fair and effective immigration system? Very broad question.
Well, I guess the first thing is to welcome people who are coming into the country, be it to work or to seek asylum, to come for refuge, as opposed to treating them as a problem, and to do it within the context of them being part of a community rather than seen as different and isolated. I mean, for asylum seekers, and you've got to address the bigger problems, and you've got to address the problems around housing. You've got to address the problems around employment, etc. For asylum seekers, though, if they gave them the right to work fairly early on, and if there was accommodation they could then move on to support themselves, they would contribute. That's what people want to do, even if they're seeking asylum. On the whole, they want to contribute. I mean, migration is the most natural thing in the world. Yeah. The number of, you and I have migrated, from different parts. People migrating from rural communities to urban communities and between countries, it's natural. It's a normal part of life. If we only see it as a problem as opposed to it's something quite natural, then we're not going to see a change in the practice, because it will always be targeting certain people who appear to be different, be it of religion or the colour of their skin. So I think we've got to just, it's changing it the way around. It's slightly off the point, but maybe it helps. When I'm doing training with people and I'm talking about them perhaps trying to take the story of someone who's seeking asylum, I say to them, start from the point of view that that person is telling you the truth and has a very good reason to be in the country. I said, it's not because I'm stupid, it's not because I'm naive, but because then you can work with that people. If something is wrong or doesn't add up, you can say that to them. Yeah. I don't understand that, or that doesn't make any sense to me, or that doesn't add up. You've got to completely change the ethos of it. No, I can't see it happening. But in terms of answer to the question, what needs to be different is completely reverse the approach. See migration as a normal fact of life. People come, people go. I mean, I think net migration in the Republic of Ireland is still higher than immigration, still. I mean, the benefit the Republic of Ireland has, if it can remember it, is knowing how Irish people were treated when they went to other countries. I mean, people still remember I don't remember the Great Famine, they're not that old, but it's still a significant part of the history. And that 1 million having to leave the country. If they could remember that, I think I did find when I was working in Dublin, and those civil servants that I knew, I'm talking about senior civil servants, had not worked outside of the Republic of Ireland. So they perhaps from the age of 16 onwards, they'd joined the civil service. They hadn't experienced what it was like to be a migrant in another country. And therefore they hadn't got the full sense of, okay, I can deal with this very differently. Yeah. And that's quite vague in some ways, but I think that's the answer. It's got to be a complete reversal. Mm-hmm. But also, of course, start dealing with the problems that most people are facing, which are common for 90% plus people across the country, is deal with those issues as opposed to, concentrating on immigration as though that is the issue. That's the problem.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, look, we spoke a little bit about the challenges, the many that there are facing people working as practitioners. We do, and recently I met with a group of students from Queen's who were really interested in getting involved in immigration in some capacity. They weren't sure in what capacity, whether that was to go on and practice as a solicitor or a barrister or go in-house to an NGO. I'd like to ask you, Sue, just what advice, finally, would you have for anyone listening who might like to get involved in our line of work in whatever capacity they would choose to do? What are the benefits from working within this area? I know what they are myself, but maybe you might like to share.
Well, I think there was a question you asked me earlier, which I think I missed, which is, who or what has inspired me along the way? And I think in answer to the question you just asked, I'll come back to that. Yeah. What has inspired me? It's not any named individuals. Mm-hmm. It is the actual people that I work for that inspires me. I mean, the incredible, and that's the benefit of working in this field. However much traveling you do worldwide, the world comes to you when you do immigration work. And your knowledge and your understanding of so many different cultures, histories, communities, etc., is opened up by virtue of the work that you do. And I'm astounded, and I still don't understand the resilience that people have for being able to cope with the systems that they are put through, be it as migrant workers whose employers are mistreating them or abusing them, or as people seeking asylum as refugees. They are amazing people. And I would treat them all as unique individuals. I mean, I used to, years ago, particularly concentrate on doing asylum claims from Libya. And so I would say 90% of my caseload was Libyan. And these stories were always very similar. And you think, okay, here we go again. Each one was quite unique. Yeah. And I think it gives you that benefit. You have the opportunity, particularly in immigration and asylum, to turn someone's life around and to give them. I've just this last week had the decision from an upper tribunal in a case I've been dealing with for 6 years. Up and down, back to the Home Office, back again, back to the courts. Finally won that appeal so that she can finally get on with her life in the United Kingdom. It takes years. And I think people have to see it as a long-term thing because nothing happens very quickly. Mm-hmm. Despite having 2 law degrees, I have never taken professional qualifications. I considered the bar and I rejected it. And so I have been in legal aid practices as a senior immigration advisor, and the same within NGOs. I think if people are thinking about the profession, as they're thinking about getting into the work, you don't need the legal qualification. You could be a paralegal, you could be an immigration advisor without having the professional qualification. But I have said to those who are younger than me, if you're serious about law, then consider the professional qualification at some point. Yeah. Somebody I know well, my goddaughter, I managed to get her, gave a notice of a job in the finance department of a legal aid firm in London, and that's where she started. Mm-hmm. Now she's a fully qualified solicitor. So that's sometimes where you have to start. Go in another way. Don't think you're going to go in and you're suddenly going to get this trainee position if you're thinking of solicitors. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily going to happen. And it isn't a question of choosing between legal aid practice or NGOs, because I've known good and bad in both. Yeah. And you might like to try a bit of both. I know people are put off by NGOs because of their experience. People are put off by legal aid firms. It's if the legal aid firms exist. But you've got to take the exams if you're going to do immigration. But first and foremost, have an interest in people. Yeah. If you're just interested in the law and the black letter of the law, don't do immigration or even human rights work. You've got to be able to see it as fundamentally going to change somebody's life or even broader than that individual or that family, something that can really benefit them. I mean, human rights is at the core of everything. And perhaps the only other thing I would say, and I'm about to say this to people, don't think that law is the same as justice, because it's not. So we can achieve justice through the legal process, but often we're struggling to get a just decision for the outcome that we want. But if you're interested in people and you want to use your legal mind or train in a legal way to bring it, then do it. One thing I found particularly useful with immigration and asylum is if you've got a forensic mind, which is nothing to do with having a legal background necessarily. If you've got a forensic mind, that's really, really useful, because then you can really dig into what the case is about, what the person is saying, understand it. You get a Home Office file, you turn it inside out, you find out something that wasn't pretty obvious. If you've got that kind of mind, this is a particularly good area for you to work in.
Brilliant. Well, that's just fantastic advice. So insightful, Sue. And I'm really appreciative and grateful for you joining me today, Sue Conlan. It's been a privilege to speak to you, and I look forward to following your work going forward.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks everyone for joining me today. If you like the show, please remember to share and leave a review if you have a moment. And you can also check out our website, www.activistlawyer.com, where you will see some blog articles written by our guests and contributors, as well as some fabulous Activist Lawyer merchandise.
This podcast was recorded in Granite Podcast Studio. Interested in starting up your own podcast but don't know how? Granite Podcast Studio can help. Record your podcast in our state-of-the-art studio, which is based in the heart of Newry City. Our studio has cutting-edge and user-friendly technology and can seat up to 4 people. We also provide an editing service for our team, using your guidance and editing notes to provide you with a flawless finished product, leaving your listeners wanting more. For more information on how you can get started, visit www.granitepodcaststudio.com.